Welcome back, everybody, to You Have Permission, the show that aims to take both Christianity and the modern world of science and culture very seriously. My name's Dan Koch. I'm a licensed therapist and a post-evangelical liberal Protestant, and I am joined today by Lauren Auer, also a licensed therapist, technically I got this written down, licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Illinois. Lauren, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Every state has its own damn lingo, and there is literally no way to know which term corresponds to another term. It's ridiculous.
It's a nightmare, honestly. Like when people are looking for therapists and haven't themselves been to a school where they've gotten a master's degree in some sort of counseling field, like
Right.
I feel for them because like, what are we even looking at? All these acronyms and all the things. It's confusing.
Yeah. I'm an LMHCA at the moment. Then soon to be Dan Koch, PsyD, licensed psychologist. I mean, no one knows what any of that means. However, It doesn't matter what those mean, what specifically they mean. What it means in this case is that you have a master's degree and you are licensed at the highest level by the state of Illinois to practice therapy, and you do good work that is based in evidence and sound practice. And you focus on trauma, and religious trauma has become a big part of that, but wasn't originally the plan. And that's going to be the first thing we talk about. But you're also, I just want to say up front, you're a great Instagram follow at Steadfast Counseling. That's going to be in the show notes. A lot of useful and helpful and clever media content about trauma therapy, essentially. And given that everybody is constantly self-diagnosing themselves these days via every social media platform, I think it's best practices to at least occasionally bring people on who are doing that work in a careful way, because everybody's on there doing it anyway. So thanks for being above board with that work.
It's hard. It's kind of the Wild West out there, but I do try really hard to make sure that it's always accurate and, I don't just throw stuff out there without thinking about it.
Yeah. And then even like, you're trained in something called brain spotting, which I wasn't even familiar with. That's a pretty new modality. But what I love is that you call it out. You say, this is a brain spotting technique. It is a modality I'm trained in. And then if people have questions, they can look it up. It's not just like Lauren's 5 tips, or whatever.
Right. Yeah. It's so funny because when I make a video like that and I refer to the modality or the research or whatever, there's always at least a few people in the comments that are like, where's the research or pseudoscience? And I'm like, okay, like all you have to do is Google it. Like it's out there. Like I literally can't go into all of the science and research behind every little tiny short form 10-second video that I post, but it's okay.
No, for sure. So what we're talking about here today is these more overt and these more subtle forms of religious trauma, how it shows up. Really briefly, I'll say trauma. The shorthand here is trauma is the thing that happens inside you, and abuse is the thing that happens outside to you. So my research is in spiritual abuse. That's what my measures, but it also measures symptoms that could be related to religious trauma. It measures internal distress symptoms and stuff like that, which are so it's kind of actually doing both. But when we use those terms, that's generally the way that people delineate between the two of them. Abuse is outside of you, trauma is inside of you, but of course they are integrally linked. Is that basically how you use those words?
Yeah, I like that description. And I think that it's important. I'm always trying to point out to people when it comes to trauma, because people want a definition of that. And I know there's a lot out there, but I like how you say what happens inside of you, because, two people can experience the exact same thing, car accident, and one person is very traumatized, has trauma symptoms from it. The other person might be generally okay. So I think it is so important to keep that in mind, especially when talking about like religious trauma, and today talking even about more subtle versus overt trauma, that it's not about one is more serious than the other, or one is more, whatever, dangerous. It's really so much about how the individual person experiences that event.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So let's start here. You didn't set out to focus on religious trauma. What brought you there?
It's been a long and winding road, but I've always been in the trauma specific field. So my undergrad, I actually went to college for criminal justice. And at the time, I was doing an internship in a juvenile detention facility, and thought I wanted to go the criminal justice route, but it was just ingrained in like every cell of my being that these kids had so much trauma that wasn't being directly addressed, at
Yeah.
least at the time and in that setting. And I couldn't get past that. And so I, went to grad school, got my master's in clinical counseling from Regent University, which is a Christian college in Virginia. And yeah, from there, I was working at an agency that worked with child sexual abuse offenders as well as victims and their families. And I worked in a women's domestic violence shelter. I worked as a sexual assault therapist. I worked in like that rape crisis agency, responding to emergency calls at the ER, going to court with people, all that kind of stuff. And then I became the
Same
director.
clientele, but not on the criminal justice legal side.
Right. Yeah. So I've worked on both sides. I've worked with the offenders and I've worked with the victims. And even in the domestic violence side, I've worked with domestic violence offenders in a group setting and also, of course, with the victims. And so I really was seeing just like all these different levels and layers, from working with very young kids to working with adults that maybe had abuse a long time ago in their life and were just now dealing with it, or, going to the ER and this is something that just happened, and being right in there. And also then I became the director of that agency. So then I was kind of dealing with a lot of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and burnout, working with my staff that was doing this work.
Yeah, some people don't believe that vicarious trauma is real, but let me just tell you, the evidence is very strong, and I've felt it in my own body that and it's true of therapists, but it's especially true of first responders who show up, and it's the other people who had the medical or physical traumatic experience, but you experience it as well. And when you have clients who've been through, I just, even yesterday in my just in my regular therapy day, I had two stories that one from each of two different clients that just like punched me in the gut, and like they could see it in my face, and I had to sort of explain myself, like, here is why that impacted me so much, because it's pressing on this and this and this. And I'm just so sorry that happened to you. And that's why we talk about self-care, and I have various things set up to not have that derail me, but it is real. You spend enough time with this stuff, and humans are naturally, we identify with each other. It's actually one of the things that makes us different from other animals. And, you get that emotional joining and that attentional joining together. And if you're not careful, or even if you are, that can turn into vicarious or secondary trauma. Oh,
yeah. Yeah. Especially, it's important to stay on top of it. But in this field, I think it's inevitable. In a lot of ways, it should be inevitable. Like, I'm more concerned by somebody who is able to listen to stories every day, day after day, and feel nothing. Like that's concerning. You should feel something and be able to recognize that. It's a sign of your humanity, to be able to deal with it.
I agree.
Yeah.
So before you actually make the turn into religious trauma, you reminded me of something. It's a story that my dad always used to tell, who's been a therapist for over 40 years now. He started out as a minister, like a high school minister. And then he was like, these kids their problems are starting younger. So he became like a junior high minister. And then he's like, no, it's even earlier. And at some point he realized, I should just be working with the parents before they fuck up their kids. And then he became a marriage and family therapist. Like that was his order of operations, of like kind of getting deeper and deeper into the thing that he actually wanted to be working on. to help
Mm-hmm.
people. And I don't know, it might be a little tidier than the actual events of history, but I find it as a helpful kind of little anecdote that does get at something true about this work, which is like what we're so interested in as people trained in psychology, especially around people who do really bad things, would become interested. Why did they do that? Is there a way to change it? What are the mechanisms? What are the interventions? And that's a level of curiosity that goes below simply being shocked and appalled and, scandalized by someone's behavior.
Right. Yeah, I love that. That's a really good thing to keep in mind, for
So
sure.
how did it turn to religious trauma work for you specifically?
Yeah. So from doing all my work up until the point of opening my own practice, being able to see trauma at all these different levels and angles and proximities and ages and ways that it presented itself. And, I grew really passionate about trauma itself specifically. And at the time in my personal life, I was really involved in my local church that I had been attending. I grew up in kind of the Christian evangelical megachurch world, doing all the things, Christian camp every summer and mission trips and, like all of the stuff. And so it was just always my life. My grandfather was also a pastor and a Christian counselor and a professor at a Christian university, and so this was just kind of my world.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason I moved away from wanting to do the agency work that I was doing and open my own practice was that at the time I was so involved with my church and that community, and I wasn't able to bring that really into the agency that I worked with. And so I thought, I really wanted to tailor this thing that was all around who I was and be able to bring all of me to the table. And so I really opened my practice initially kind of, steadfast counseling with that Christian religious
I was going to
base.
ask about that term. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where I was at the time. That was in, let's see, end of 2020. So, a really wonderful time to open a practice was the end
perfect.
of 2020. Right. So that was going on, and it kind of ended up happening just that, there was a lot of changes going on in the church that I was a part of too around that time, which I'm sure is also, an experience that a lot of people maybe had in the year 2020, that there was maybe some changes in their church.
Was it like vaccine and mask stuff related kind of stuff in during that George Floyd racial stuff? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It was kind of like before that point, there were things that would, I don't know, at social events or even just on Sunday at church, sometimes like a comment or something would be said where I'm like, oh, they kind of see things different than me politically, but that's okay. And like, whatever. And we just kind of move beyond that.
Yeah.
But I think a big part of that, the political climate, it was the things that used to be, tolerable for me became less and less tolerable.
Was that because they became less tolerable inside you, or was it that, as I like to say, the culture war spares nobody, and the culture war, the sort of gravity of that sort of as a black hole kind of sucked things up into it and sort of amplified them on the outside? Was it a little bit of both? What do you think?
I think it was a little bit of both. I've always been my whole life one that I can see everybody's point of view, very much a peacemaker. I don't like confrontation.
Good skill for a therapist. Got to get into the client's mindset. Way to go. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think some of that I could always kind of just distance myself from or be like, oh, they just see that differently than me, whatever, agree to disagree. But it was twofold, because I think part of the thing with this work that I do, and especially coming from a space where I worked in an agency in the community that provided free services for all sorts of people, I've worked with so many people that have lives and beliefs and all these things that are so different from anything I've experienced in my own life. And I think just being able to have the privilege of sitting across from so many people like that and really vulnerably hearing all these people's stories and experiences, like for me, I don't know how anybody can separate that. Like, it's just
No, totally.
how, yeah, it's just that impacted the way I saw the world. And I think that was the foundation of my own personal values and beliefs. And, I just had some really significant experiences like that. And the biggest real sticking point, I guess, with me was one of the main pastors of our church posted something on his social media, essentially like really condoning conversion therapy. And,
Wow.
There was, I don't know what had happened somewhere. They had made it illegal, I think, which,
Yeah.
a lot.
I mean,
Yeah.
even I was just researching this for,
For you?
yeah, I think it was for a video that I was making for Instagram, actually. And I was looking into like how common is this still? And it is actually not that common anymore. Even in conservative
Yeah.
spaces, all the main conservative organizations, your focus on the families, things of that ilk, they have all moved on from that. Exodus International, which was the biggest one, closed its doors, apologized, not because they'd become liberals. Like, it doesn't work. It's against the science. And yes, even plenty of Christian counselors, Christian therapists care about science. Some don't. But like, so it's really, thankfully, it's just becoming very, a lot less common, but it is still out there, more fringe groups, but it's actually just quite conservative, like quite fringy groups that are still embracing it. So that would have been a head turner and would have been kind of gutting, I think.
Yeah, it was hard to see because the post was, kind of like more his own feelings of disappointment and anger that somebody or some place had made it illegal.
Yeah.
And I had reached out to him privately at the time, kind of thinking like, well, I'm a therapist. Like, I went to a Christian university. Like, this is something that I know about, that
Yeah.
I have education on, that even in my Christian university that I went to, was fully like, it's illegal for a reason, and it doesn't work. Like, it literally doesn't work. So I was kind of wanting to be like, hey, let's have a conversation if you want to understand this more. I think that post maybe could hurt some people if they saw it, and, kind of really just not I wasn't upset as much as I was like, here's something that I know a lot about that it seems like he probably doesn't know a lot about. And that conversation was very much, not willing to be open-minded, not willing to hear anything. And so really that was the turning point for me, is because I think I was willing to stay in that environment for the period of time that I was, because I had the probably assumption or idea that I had enough of a relationship with those people that we could at least, even if we disagreed, I don't need everyone to agree with me, but just to be able to even have like intelligent, educated conversations on why I see something the way I do. And if they want to tell me why they see it the way they do, I'm more than happy to engage in conversations like that. But that was just not the response that I got. And I kind of, felt like, okay, well then I don't know if I can align with that. And really then from around that time, I was also doing a lot more inner diving into, oh, wait, what did I grow up with in the church? Like, because I never really questioned anything or been curious or asked questions. It didn't really occur to me as much until around that period of time. And so, yeah, I was just doing my own exploration around stuff. And that's kind of where I was personally. And now I'm running this Christian practice. And I'm like, wait, what is the Bible? What does that mean? Like, oh, it was just this crazy, like, I thought I opened this practice wanting to do this thing that aligned with me. And so I could bring my whole self to the table. And then I'm like, 6 months in and I'm like, but wait, who am I? What is left and right and up and down and like, I'm like, oh my gosh, it was so disorienting. um, so yeah, doing my own work. And the crazy thing is that I never, at that time, I was still very much advertising as a Christian counselor, Christian agency. That was on my website, all of that. And what ended up happening was I don't know what you want to make of it or whatever, but I kept getting these clients that were going through similar things themselves. And so they weren't coming to me because they knew that I was going through that, because that part was not public at all at the time, especially.
Oh, just the sort of overt Christianity was public, but not the like, I do religious trauma.
Right. But I kept getting people sitting across from me in therapy that were like going through their own religious trauma or had in the past. And it was this dance initially of kind of like, how much can I say in here? Because this girl's a Christian, like, and it wasn't even like, oh, there was this one church in my community that kept having these people. It was literally like different denominations, different sizes of churches, different, stuff that had happened a long time ago, stuff that was currently happening. Like it was just this extra layer of my eyes opening up to this. And a lot of it was honestly validating for me. And none of those people really knew what I was going through or my experience. I didn't, every now and then, if, self-disclosure was appropriate in some way, I would, but it wasn't public at all. And so I think a lot of that helped. And then the more that I kind of moved stuff to my social media and I was talking a little more openly about religious trauma, I, then would get more and more people, or a lot of people would say, hey, this is a safe person to talk to about this. And I think there was almost this sense of safety for a lot of people that were currently going through things that like, it felt safe to go to a Christian counselor, or they wanted somebody who was safe in that way, but also that they could talk about their real experiences of the things that they were going through. And so, yeah, it honestly kind of just snowballed from there. And so now, I think I've done a lot of deep diving into how that's similar to all the trauma work I had done before.
Right.
And there's so many big similarities, obviously. I mean, it's all trauma, but I think the thing that stands out to me the most over and over and over again is that subtle trauma. Like a lot of times the people that are coming to me for counseling, they're not coming for that reason, and they're coming for something else because they maybe don't even recognize it as trauma until we start getting into it.
That happens with regular clients too, like a lot for me. It's like people, especially if something happened a long time ago, you may have a sense that you've gotten through this, you don't think about it as much anymore. And then we'll dig into something and it's like, that event or series of events is still, in my opinion, exerting a ton of pressure on your current life. And I think that we actually need to work on that. So that's just like a general client thing I've noticed, even separate from the specifically religious context.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cause I think it's easy, in quotes, that like, obviously, if somebody experienced a major devastating natural disaster or war or major loss or whatever, we can easily slap a label of trauma on that. We can all agree that there's stuff that's traumatizing about those situations. But it is, I think, oftentimes the things that people have a harder time processing, working through, is the stuff that isn't so overt.
Yeah, I mean, Bessel van der Kolk's definition of trauma, which I think has now kind of become the standard in the field, it's basically an experience that our nervous system, which includes our brain and our, our cognition, that our nervous system can't process at the time that it happens. Right. And so then that kind of kicks the can down the road, and that's like a rupture of a sort. Of course, we don't don't understand the brain well enough to be able to describe sort of physically what's going on there, but that metaphorical language is pretty good. And then you have these sort of predictable effects from when that happens. And what's interesting is, well, I actually want to start with the overt stuff and then get into the subtle, which will be kind of the bulk of our conversation, these more subtle forms. But maybe we could contrast it with sort of more overt symptoms of religious trauma. To start off, I was just thinking, you see a lot of PTSD symptoms. Like I do in my clients. So there might be some avoidance. We're avoiding church, or we're avoiding certain people, which can even be loved ones, family members. We're avoiding certain conversation topics because they will kind of get our nervous system into overactive mode, right? We're trying to avoid triggers. We're trying to avoid panic experiences. We flashbacks, and other forms of re-experiencing tough moments on that traumatic journey. Heightened physiological responses around reminders of this stuff, hypervigilance to be able to help us avoid. Those are kind of what I came up with as these are more overt aspects. Like, okay, this is where religious trauma looks very similar to other forms of trauma, like PTSD from war or sexual assault or something like that. And that does show up as well with religious trauma clients. I wonder what you'd maybe add to that list of like more overt, kind of big, bold, fairly straightforward aspects of this.
Yeah, I think that often when I think of overt trauma, it's more of that, if there's like that immediate or intense reaction, that it's clear, maybe they were sleeping through the night okay, and now they're having nightmares and barely sleeping. It's immediate, it's intense. There's a shift.
A big break with regular life, basically.
Right. And that is something that I think it's easy in those situations to be like, oh, wow, I am not sleeping. I'm having nightmares. All these things are happening. I'm having flashbacks. I need to maybe get some therapy, right? Or I need to address this. This is definitely impacting me because there was such a shift. And so that's kind of the way that I look at overt trauma. Is it's typically pretty obvious to themselves or the people around them that there has been something major that's happened.
I would probably put most instances of clergy sex abuse as well into this category of overt,
right,
where it's like, okay, this is a member of the clergy sexually abused you. That is an overt form of religious trauma or of spiritual abuse alongside sexual abuse. And we're going to expect, again, people have very different capacities for handling bad experiences, but we're going to expect some significant signs of this in pretty short order. That's a very major experience. I'm trying to think of something kind of not to that level of sexual abuse, which is very straightforward, but like what's another example of something that mimics enough other types of traumatic experiences that would still be in that kind of big, bold category? Like, can you think of anything?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, like with trauma, like the disclaimer of it's more of how the person experiences it. So that's important to know. But I think, sometimes with like doctrinal abuse and the fact of like using scripture specifically to like instill fear, shame, or guilt, and like justify maybe abuse or discrimination, like that, you can have a conversation with, a clergy member where they say something that's very overtly shaming or discriminating that you're feeling trauma symptoms from, right? Like that kind of thing. I think a lot of times it's because there's such that power dynamic a lot of times in certain religious structures that anytime that you're meant to feel kind of isolated, rejected, or abused in those ways can, for some people, be extremely overtly traumatic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the overt stuff. But I think, of more interest to us today and just in chatting before, off mic, I know this is a big interest of yours, are these more subtle forms. And my own spiritual abuse screener and scale really gets at both parts of it. But it is true to me that the subtlety becomes more like this is. I always have to be careful when I talk about it this way, and I even have to tell clients, like, a lot of times I smile when they have said something really painful, and I explain to them the reason I'm smiling is that you have hit pay dirt. And I'm anticipating the type of growth that's going to come from this. It's not because I'm happy that you're in pain, but I'm getting hopeful now because we are dealing with the real stuff. And in that sense, this stuff is more interesting because, bring me a war vet with combat PTSD. Like, I'm very engaged. That's going to be good work. We've got a good standard sort of what we're going to do with that. But like this stuff is like a little bit more of a frontier topic. And so it's a little bit more sticky intellectually, it's not so settled. And maybe that's why we kind of get more, that's why I get more interested in it. I don't know if that's true for you. I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes they say something and I'm like, okay, here we go. We're off to the races. Like,
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's the best feeling. So I just wanted to say in the longish history of spiritual abuse research and writings, the idea of subtlety, the concept of subtlety has actually been around for a long time. So one of the early books, I believe it's from the 90s. This is before what I would call the current phase, which is like a peer-reviewed phase of research that we are now in with spiritual abuse. Like I have a Google Scholar alert and stuff comes out like every few weeks. Like there is real careful academic work being done around spiritual abuse. It didn't start that way. It started a lot in the 90s with like kind of evangelical, almost more like leadership types and some Christian therapists going, whoa, there's something going on here. And one of those first books is a book called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. And so I just think it's interesting to note that from the beginning, the incipient days of people looking at this topic the way that we do now, in a research mode, the idea of subtlety, it's been in there. So there is something that seems very apt about talking about it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and not in everybody's experience, but I think one of the aspects that I often find makes more religious trauma become more subtle is I think of that analogy of like the frog in the pot of boiling water, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times people, they've always been kind of in that environment. This is how people interact. This is what's normal. This is what's expected. This is what's valued. This is what's not. That, that environment sometimes grows that subtlety around it because it's so normalized. Some of the ways trauma may be introduced to them, maybe it's the way that certain people are treated or spoken about or whatever the case may be. But if that is their norm, it doesn't necessarily feel like, the water is burning me when you're just used to it. Right.
My own story of spiritual abuse, which I've told before, but I'll tell very briefly here, is in sixth grade, age 11, getting a book from some adult at my Christian junior high and elementary school, or it was like a K through 6, getting this book that basically was obviously fucking self-published, that saying that Jesus would return in about 6 months. And it gave September of, I think it was 1994, 95, must have been 95.
Yeah. And
that was subtle insofar as these kinds of teachings were at least somewhat in the water. It wouldn't have been totally out of left field to read something about the return of Jesus. By 11, having grown up evangelical, even in a pretty moderate strain of it, out in sunny California, I still would have been aware of that. So it wouldn't have seemed to me like some whack job writing a pamphlet, which is in fact what it was. And that then, and what it told me was, you're going to die in 6 months. So get your affairs in order. Yeah. And I had panic attacks for every night for a month. And whatever. Go from there. That eventually, that was the beginning of the path that led to me, creating a scale for measuring spiritual abuse. Like that was the beginning of it. But it actually, that is a more subtle thing, because if someone had said, hey kids, a school shooter's coming, you're all going to die, that would be overt, regular kind of trauma. But because these teachings were integrated enough into my worldview and the worldview of my religious community, I would call that more subtle, because it was just like an amping up, like a turning up of some of those knobs to 10 that made me consider my mortality at a way too young age. Right. And yeah, so that's subtle. That's subtle.
Can I ask you, that book, pamphlet, whatever you want to call it, like, did you happen across it? Where was it? Like, how did you end up with that?
I wish I had a better memory. My memory of it, which I can't be sure about, is that some adult at the school, maybe who thought I was like, I don't know, more intellectually capable or something like that, or maybe thought I needed some disciplinary, I needed some fire lit under me, because like I wasn't the like rough kid, but my best friend was like the roughest kid. And I was kind of like drafting off of his badassness. And I was from public school. Like I had been at public school for 5 years. So I don't know if it was like a corrective thing or like hey, this might be good for you. In either way, it's just like insanely developmentally inappropriate. Sure. And, so I wish I could remember. I don't remember which person it was. I don't remember if it was my teacher or an administrator or what.
Well, the reason I ask is because like, I think that's part of it for people too. Like you're telling the story. I remember I was probably 10 or 11. I don't know. And I remember like my mom was reading my brother and I like the Left Behind books before bed every night.
Yeah.
And so like there, that's traumatizing in and of itself and the end times, and like literally painting a picture of what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
But for an adult that I trusted and I knew cared about me and caring for me in my best interest. Like, I don't know if it was a teacher that gave that to you or an adult in authority. I think that adds an extra layer too of like, here's a person I know cares about me and my well-being. And obviously the intention wasn't, I'm going to traumatize my kids every night, but like that adds to that subtlety of I had my own emotions and fears around the rapture coming. But if this is my mom who cares for me and loves me, giving me this information, like it must be good. And how confusing that is too, is part of that subtle traumatic experience.
Yeah, there's almost like a model that is forming in my mind in real time here. So if this plane doesn't land, that's my disclaimer. But I think about someone who gets to the age where they realize that they are queer sexually. And before they get there, or, people have different stories. Some people say like I was 5 or 6 and I could tell I was different. But even then, like there's no sex hormones yet, right? So there's as I understand it, sexually, there is a developmental pattern that everybody has to go through in one way or another. And what's interesting about people who basically realize they're queer from within those religious traditions that have very harsh teachings about that is that they're already primed for this to cause a bunch of conflict and chaos. And that's very much like the frog in the boiling water. That's like literal. I mean, that's like a perfect analogy for something like that, because that sexual development does happen in stages. It happens over time. And you're kind of, again, not anybody's intention, but you're setting up this kid for getting to just every year that passes, every stage of psychosexual development that they go through, increasing that lived and felt sense of conflict between what they're experiencing and the overt teachings of their group, which are required for membership, safety, especially the younger you are, safety and provision and basic community. The older you get, like the needs get higher up on the Maslow hierarchy or whatever, but they're still all connected to you not being queer, unless you were lucky to be raised fucking Episcopal or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because like when I think about, the work that I do with clients that have experience and are trying to heal from those more subtle forms of trauma, I think one of the biggest things that I see is, this stuckness around trying to learn to trust their own perceptions and emotions and like the nuance that can be involved in that. And yeah, it's like if there's, all of the people at the formative years of your life when you're learning about the world are telling you one thing, but internally you're feeling another thing, then it's hard to kind of suss out like, can I trust myself? Can I trust other people? Or other people maybe that's a good, like with my mom reading those books to us, like that's a good person. I do trust her.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for like, does anybody that I trust in the world, could they do harm? Like, it's so confusing for people to figure that out. And like, there's not really a clear answer to that.
So where this is taking me is probably this, I would say this is maybe the number one issue that, like, the most common issue that comes up with me with clients who want to work on anything involving religion, which is, I don't know, maybe 2/3 of my clients. And it is one of those things for which there is no obvious answer. And the type of therapy that I primarily engage in, which is cognitive therapy, sort of brings this tension front and center, because when we're doing cognitive therapy, the number one question, one of the top 2 or 3 questions that clients are asking themselves over and over again, every time they have an automatic interpretive thought about the world, is what, as they get better at this, they constantly ask themselves, what is the evidence for this? And what is the evidence against this? And developing trust in your basic ability to determine levels of evidence, maybe not, you don't get everything right all the time, and sometimes you might be wrong, but a general sense of like, I can assess if there's a lot of evidence for this or a lot of evidence against it or something like that. You get to a question like, what if I'm wrong and God is actually just going to send me to hell? And then I go, well, what's the evidence for that? And right at that moment, that's a tough moment, because what you're talking about, who do we learn to trust on what basis? Your mom, in a general global sense, was absolutely a trustworthy person in your life, right? But on that issue, she was dead wrong. How do we come to that perspective? Because that's not so simple as, oh, well, I heard it from this lady at my evangelical elementary school, but she was batshit crazy. And or my aunt told me, and then she also sent me a forward about Biden and the Pope collaborating on the vaccine. So she's not trustworthy. What about the people who mostly are trustworthy, in some areas, but not others? And then how do we develop this capacity to check the evidence ourselves, which is so necessary for cognitive therapy? I think about that weekly, every week, sometimes daily.
Yeah, it's super complicated. And I think sometimes, I don't know, in those situations, I mean, there is the, being able to kind of get comfortable in the discomfort of holding all of that ambiguity together and the not knowing, which is sometimes that is the best thing you can do. And that also feels really uncomfortable, right?
But you can't stay there forever with certain questions. Because, and this is interesting to kind of slightly get into the whole public person on Instagram angle here, which now you and I share, as I've been making more of an attempt to do that recently. The commenters come out of the fucking woodwork, and you hear explicitly, you read explicitly, over and over again the worst versions of some of the stuff you heard growing up, and that millions of people believe. Now, not most people seeing your video don't believe like the commenters. The commenters are a self-selected group of people with an interesting sense of what's worth their time. But the language is so similar that it's like it's like a whiplash back to a different time and place, and when different things seemed plausible. And you do need to, like, I need to have a fairly secure sense that, like, I don't know, for instance, my entire podcasting, therapy, parenting models or whatever aren't all bullshit because the fundamentalists are actually right. And I can't live in that tension all the time. I wouldn't be able to get any work done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's impossible. It really is. And I think, anything that I've ever posted that's been controversial, I know on your podcast recently you've had several episodes around like the, what's his first name? Robert Hayes?
The Richard Hayes book. Yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah,
so
and
I had something.
You had a big video about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And really, even that video that I posted about it, I even said in the video, it was kind of like, here's this thing that happened. And that was like, I wasn't really giving an opinion. The book hasn't even been released yet. I don't know what the book says, nobody knows what the book says yet. Cause it's September, I think it's coming out. And I was just making the point in my video that, I really appreciated that here's this man, this scholar that is known for what the type of research he does. And I don't know how old he is, but in his older age or whatever, after having already formed a public opinion, just to be able, to go back and not just see, I think it's easy to look through just that lens, and do research that kind of just ends up validating what you already believe, right? Like it's something that happens often. So for somebody to be able to, be open-minded enough to consider other options or to look at things from different angles than what they've already publicly said, regardless, even if it was opposite, like if this was a person that had been very, queer affirming and was able to, have all these conversations and do all these research studies and like really look into this and change their mind on that, like I'd probably listen to them. I don't know if I'd agree with them. I don't know. But like I just was making the point that I think it's respectful that here's this person that's thinking critically enough to be able to really kind of know. I mean, obviously there's a lot of backlash around it. Like it's not an easy thing to put out there. And so, but a lot of those comments, obviously it was like, well, what does the book say? I'm like, well, I say clearly in the message, it hasn't come out yet, but not engaging. I think there is just no point in that sometimes. Like it's just, these people heard what they wanted to hear from what I posted. They missed the point. Like,
they're not the real audience. Right.
Yeah.
But I think, it gets at something that does play out in my life and my clients' lives that is directly about this kind of thing I've just been talking about, which is that, there is a version of Christianity, and I am positive that this exists in other religions as well. It is essentially a form of fundamentalism or fundamentalism adjacent that says changing our minds is bad. We have the truth and we raise our children. We teach them the way they should go. We teach them the truth. And we don't stray from it. That is literally the worldview. I think you can find people who will explicitly say that. And that's the thing that I can't accept because it's not true. Because even the person in that fundamentalist church is choosing among options of Christian leaders to trust. They are choosing among churches they could attend. If you ask anybody who posts that, if you ask them, if you look up where they live and say, why do you go to this church and not these other churches? They're going to give you a reason. They have already made an act of discernment into which church they're going to go to and not the other church. And that's basically all I'm doing. That's all I'm asking my clients to do. It is fundamentally something that we're doing already. I like to say it's discernment all the way down. There's no bedrock. Everybody is actually discerning from various multiple options, choices of authority, of information, of whatever. Often this is done unthinkingly, of course. So there's a lot of people right now who are drawn to Mark Driscoll because they're drawn to his no bullshit manly attitude or something. That is what they're into. And it's not because he's been a consistent Bible teacher, because you could very easily find out that he's not been consistent. He's changed the basic stream of Christianity he's been, and he's on his third one now. He's done with Reformed and now he's Pentecostal or whatever. I mean, the dude's a chameleon, but he projects something that some people go, I like that. I'm drawn to that. That is an act of discernment. And I think that ultimately what I have to remind myself and help clients with is like, you're already doing it. You are already discerning one claim over another. Let's take ownership over that. Let's do it as well as we can do it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's even a layer within that. Like, I mean, I think the people oftentimes when they're like, this is the way that you have to do it, this is the right one, I'm going to follow and just unquestioningly do everything this way. Oftentimes the root is fear of, I'm going to follow the formula because I don't know what the other thing looks like. Or if I question this one little piece of it, what does that mean for the rest of the dominoes? You know, so a lot of times that is fear-based at its very core. And even that in of itself, to make your decisions and live your life based off of fear, is also a form of subtle trauma, right? People can absolutely experience it that way.
Okay, thanks for bringing us back to subtle religious trauma and spiritual abuse. I want to at least ask you about one of these kind of terms that you've used that I am not familiar with that would go under this header of subtle religious trauma. And the first one, and maybe we'll get to more, but I'm interested in, what is tactful inattention? What's that mean?
Yeah, tactful inattention. The way that I think about that most people could probably relate to on some level is if you're like in I don't know, let's say just like the grocery store, right? And there's like a toddler who wants the whatever sugary cereal and his mom said no. And so this toddler's throwing this like giant fit and just totally like kicking and screaming on the ground, right? And you're noticing it, but you're like not going to sit there and gawk at him. You're not going to get involved. You're just going to like keep walking and pretend, you know, like it's none of your business, right?
Yeah.
That in a wide range is tactful inattention.
That's
like,
a good use of tactful. That's a polite use of tactful inattention.
Right. It's kind of like avoiding the obvious discomfort or the confrontation, the thing that is outside of the social norm, just so you can kind of maintain the status quo, not make anybody uncomfortable, not rock the boat, right? It's just like, we're just going to go about our own thing. Okay, that can be a good thing. But in terms of religious tactful inattention, I think, you know, there are too many times when this plays out to an extent where it can be really harmful, where, you know, I mean, that can look a lot of ways, obviously. I mean, we see, you know, the reports of abuse that's widespread in certain churches or whatever. And I think sometimes things go unchecked or unresponded to for so long because of this tactful inattention of like, we're not going to really pay attention to that because there's all this other good, you know, like we don't want to detract from all the good that's happening. So
one of the subtypes of spiritual abuse on my scale is maintaining the system. Yeah. And that can happen from leaders, but it happens from like, you know, not the head pastor, elders, deacons, just families within the church, individuals within the church, where it's like, hey, there's so much momentum here that this system is really working. It's producing all this fruit. It's, it's doing however people think about that. So now this person's coming in and they're saying there's something grievously wrong, but
Right.
the system's working. So it must be like, we're just going to kind of downplay that. And maybe that will be some victim blaming. Maybe that would be some gaslighting, whatever we've got to do to sort of like keep the status quo. It sounds like that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I think too, it's not like, I don't think everybody's always making the active choice to participate in it.
Right. Totally
I think
agreed.
that especially in, when there's a structure of power, that if there's even just one or two people in power tactfully, not paying attention to something, the other people around them may assume that it's being handled, or
Yep.
may think it's not actually that big of a deal, or
because
whatever.
you're taking your cues from the leader that you trust, and if it's not a big deal to them, then I don't need to worry about it.
Yeah. And so they may not actually, it's not like everybody is kind of looking around going, are we all going to ignore this? Maybe in some circumstances, but I think that, there's also oftentimes that there's a lot of people that don't even realize that they're participating in it because they're following the cues of the people that they trust and that, they feel safe with.
And that's normal psychology. I mean, like I don't consume a ton of politics. The one thing I usually listen to is the 10-minute long PBS NewsHour on Fridays with David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart. And if they bring up a topic and both David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, if they both go, yeah, I think this is kind of a nothing burger, then I go, cool, I can stop thinking about it.
Yeah.
If they both agree that this is like just a media story or something and is not going to have an impact on the world or our country or something, then great. They just saved me time from having to read up on something. Right. Similarly, if they both go, I think this is really something to watch, then my ears perk up and I go, okay, maybe this is something that as a citizen, I need to pay more attention to. I mean, just think that's just politics, but you could think of it in any number of ways. Is this a band I would love? 5 people tell you, go see this movie. Okay, I'm taking my cues. So we do that. That's just like a normal part of human psychology, but it's because we have this spiritual authority that is inescapable. I don't think that spiritual leaders should, I don't know, pretend they don't have spiritual authority. That would be, I mean, maybe there's ways to kind of minimize it, but that's kind of weird. Like humans have always, we look to mentors, we look to people in authority. That's probably pretty baked into human psychology. So it's more about using it well than it is like pretending you don't have it. I don't know. That's maybe my personal bias.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of self-gaslighting that can happen in a situation like that. Like if you listen to that regularly, you really respect the person, right? Like if you were to go have lunch with one of them and they were saying something was wonderful, that your experience was that it wasn't, you may be questioning yourself of like, well, I really respect that person, so maybe I experienced that wrong, and you don't say anything. Yeah. And I think
and that would not matter so much if it's like some particular bill that was just put on the president's desk. But if that thing we're talking about is like, oh, someone's telling me that I've been causing people to sin at my church for years and years, but I don't feel like I have been. Now we're getting into, and like, but that's about my status before God. Maybe might be like a purity culture thing there, or it might be about, quote, sowing discontent, or something like that, when I'm just actually trying to tell a story of how I was harmed by someone and I'm being labeled as a Jezebel, or I'm being labeled as, a whatever, some male version of that, and then it's like, and that does cause you to question, am I losing it? Can I trust myself? And now we're on a path that can get pretty rough pretty quick when we stop trusting fundamental parts of ourselves.
Yeah. Because I think really like at it, the core thing I see again with that more subtle trauma is that internal kind of feeling of trusting your own perception, trusting your own emotion, how, all of that gradual stuff can be really, really hard to grapple with. Of like, who am I? What do I believe? Am I right? Have I been seeing it wrong the whole time? So yeah, I mean, it's difficult for sure.
It is. Well, Lauren, I think that this is an okay place to wrap up.
Okay.
in terms of if people, I guess this is a good time to maybe address the listener who might be wondering if it's time for some therapy around these issues, depending on what they're kind of seeing in their own story. I am not taking clients right now. Are you taking clients? Is it only Illinois? Do you do the telehealth thing?
So yeah, I'm licensed in the state of Illinois. So until the interstate compact wants to get it together for my state,
Right.
I am just stuck doing stuff in Illinois on an individual level. However, you know, I do like different speaking engagement stuff like that. A lot of them can, trainings people can join via Zoom. So I'm posting about that stuff. It's updated on my website, my social media, which you named in the beginning. So if anybody, wants to get in contact with me or even just follow along on my social media, I try to, I don't know. I mean, I try to just put some of this stuff out there in a way that's hopefully easy to understand for people. To hopefully kind of validate some of these experiences that, maybe they see something or hear this episode or whatever, and they're like, oh my gosh, maybe I've been questioning, my own emotions about this. And maybe actually, wait, this is trauma. Maybe I should get therapy, that's the goal really, is to normalize it.
Totally. And there is a directory that I will often send people to who are out of state or who have emailed me even before I was accepting clients because of my interest in psychology. It's called the Reclamation Collective. Josh will put a link in the notes. The only thing to say about that is these are clinicians who self-identify as being competent to deal with religious issues like religious trauma. So you might want to reach out, maybe ask a couple questions before you start working with somebody, but it's a much more fruitful place to start than just your local psychologytoday.com directory or whatever. So we'll put that in the show notes. And if you are interested in what Lauren said today and you're on Instagram, I highly recommend following her. Again, that's in the notes. And thanks so much. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.